Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Hello, I'm Stephen Willis from the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. We were going to be joined by John Macon Gillespie. He's feeling a little bit ill today. He forwarded me his notes from practice. We're going to do that, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff that Lane Kiffin said post-practice, along with the fact Umanmielen and Caden Prieskorn was there as well. The practice, like I said, is a spring practice. If anybody is going into these spring practices looking for big picture type things, you're doing this wrong, period. You shouldn't be worried about necessarily who's playing when, who's playing where, and who's playing how often at this point. The most important thing that you need to pay attention to are matchups. That's what all of this is all about. Like stuff where iron sharpens iron as they're getting ready for the 2024 season. I mean, Trey Amos and Tre Harris are continually battling across spring. Like I said, players themselves have called this must-see television, essentially, to where they're going to stop what they're doing and they're going to watch the reps of those two players going to each other one-on-one. Umanmielen continues to get further. We're going to talk about him more on the show tomorrow, but he actually said that he feels like he's being developed at Ole Miss for the first time in his career, which is absolutely weird. And he had a ton of great stuff to talk about in regards to Pete Golding and his defense as well. He said that Jackson Dart was the man that led his recruitment from Florida in the transfer portal. And it's weird that here, Jackson Dart's kind of friends with everybody. It's his team. And at Florida, the quarterbacks usually just hang out together and there's very cliquish and things like that. So that was kind of interesting. We're going to talk about that on tomorrow's show. Caden Prieskorn said he wasn't even really healthy until the very end of the season. And that makes sense because in the past game, he became a weapon towards the end of the season, and especially against the number one defense in Penn State. So that works out as well. Now, the main thing from yesterday's practice, or today's practice, I should say, since this is going to air at 7 at night, is Lane Kiffin talked about how this roster stands up against other rosters he's been a part of. Now, in his mind, there's no doubt that this is the best roster that has been with him at Ole Miss. This is the most talented team he has had. So much so that when he was thinking about the talent of this roster, he's like, well, what about the USC team in 2003 or the Alabama game in 2015 or the Alabama team? And those are two of the better rosters in the history of college football that he was thinking about where this Ole Miss roster sits. And he did say that this roster is more top heavy than those were. And that's largely because of the transfer portal. You're not going to be able to stockpile 85 players on a roster the way that you used to could do. You just can't. It's not going to be that way, and all the rosters are going to be more top heavy. But at the top of this roster, the way he talked about, they compare pretty favorably to those other ones. It's just the depth to where they separated and went on about their separate ways. Now, Lane Kiffin was quick to point out that even though this is a talented roster, this is not a talented team yet, which, we've talked about in the last couple of days, the dichotomy of Lane Kiffin, because of the transfer portal, needing Ole Miss to be the it place and continuing to do that while also trying to preach inside the walls rat poison. You need the rat poison for recruitment to get people inside the walls, and then you start talking about the rat poison. And that's pretty consistently happening. Another thing that Lane Kiffin brought up was about the technology that is going to be allowed in college football in 2024. And the way it works, Lane Kiffin described it as a cheat code offensively for him. And what he means by that, I'm assuming, but they quit communication at about 15 seconds left in the play clock. Ole Miss usually snaps the ball between 20 and 24 seconds, I think, which means until the ball is snapped, the coach is right there to give instructions to the quarterback of what's happening downfield. You have people in the press conference or in the press box that's going to identify coverages. They're probably going to point out 1, 2, 3, or 4, and they're just going to say before the snap that number 3 should be open. And because of that, Lane Kiffin's probably going to be able to do those Lane Kiffin shot plays even more effectively in 2024. Now, the benefit for the defense and the reason they wanted to do it is because they don't have to spend so much time looking to the sideline, and they can go ahead and get lined up and get their cleats in the dirt, as coaches like to say. That's the reason defenders want it. But a coach like Lane Kiffin, knowing how to utilize that, knowing how to get information to his quarterback immediately pre-snap, is going to be a cheat code for Lane Kiffin. And I think everybody needs to pay attention to what's going to go on, because I think he could be dangerous, especially with a third-year starting quarterback in Jackson Dart and with experienced wide receivers like Juice Wells, Tre Harris, even younger guys like Caden Lee or Jordan Watkins, who's a more senior guy as well. Should be a really interesting thing. It's just funny that Lane Kiffin referred to as a cheat code. And with Lane Kiffin referring to it as a cheat code, defenses need to be afraid. Defenses really need to be afraid, because his schematic genius and his willingness to do whatever it takes to win means that Ole Miss is probably going to be pretty good in this system. And probably because Ole Miss is practicing with it right now, and they're seeing exactly what you can do and how it works. By the time the football season gets here, it's going to be a well-oiled machine. I'm really interested to see what Ole Miss and Furman line up and how that looks offensively. Pretty good. Now, Juice Wells, he mentioned, is not currently practicing at the moment. He's recovering from an injury, apparently. At least that's what he said in the press conference. I was not literally out there. I got my notes from John Macon Gillespie and the Growth Report. But there are some players that are kind of standing out and using this time to make themselves better and more of a name going into the season. And one of those players is Cayden Lee. Cayden Lee is playing in the slot. He's doing what he needs to do. He's taking advantage of the injuries to actually get some outside reps as well. Cayden Lee is a guy that could end up on the field this season because, as Lane Kiffin said in the press conference today, Cayden is the type of guy that before he leaves Ole Miss is going to be special. And that's what Lane Kiffin said. And Cayden Lee is that guy. He is an offensive version of Mike Hilton. That's what he is. He might be a little bit undersized. He might not be somebody that you freak out about when you look at, but when he gets on the field, he turns into an alpha dog and he runs everything. He's a guy that didn't hardly play during the season, but Jordan Watkins injured a hamstring, and here was Cayden Lee thrust in to play slot receiver against the number one defense in all of the college football. And Cayden Lee just became uncoverable. He kind of lets you know what you have. You have Jordan Watkins, who is Mr. Reliable, Mr. Dependable. But you also have a Cayden Lee that is going to fight and claw and try and do whatever he needs to do to get on the football field. And he's taken full advantage of that this spring. So I think if anything came from the first 4 or 5 practices of spring, is that it appears Cayden Lee has taken another step. For better or for worse, we'll see what it looks like once we get closer to what's going to go on in the fall. But he is doing what needs to be done. And it's no matter what happens, he's fulfilled his end of the bargain. Anyway, thank you again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. And we're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Again, so apologies for John Macon Gillespie not being here. He's not feeling well, but this was what practice looked like a little bit today. Tomorrow on the show, on the podcast, we're going to talk more about Princely Umanmielen and his comments about being developed and things like that. We're going to go on that. We're going to talk a little bit more about practice today, some of the other stuff, maybe some of the stuff that Caden Prieskorn said in his press conference. And we're going to look at transfer portal players that Ole Miss men's basketball needs to look out for coming soon. Anyway, Thanks a lot. We'll see you tomorrow. Hotty toddy, everyone.